All right, and welcome back, Real Leaders, to this Real Leaders Plus Thursday session where we're going to take a peek under the hood of Alter Eco Foods with the CEO of Alter Eco Foods, Mr. Keith Bearden. Keith, my man, thanks for coming on today.
Glad to be here. It's great to see some familiar faces.
Of course, of course. Well, Keith, I appreciate one just taking the time to be here. We did a episode, gosh, when was that? Probably, I think back in October, November,
Yeah,
maybe.
yeah,
And
October.
where we got to cover a lot. And folks, for those of you who don't know about kind of the chocolate industry, the cacao industry, it's such a fascinating just like segment. Like I learned actually yesterday again. I went to a little TEDx event here. Our friend Annette Mason, who also was at Unite, came to TEDx. She invited and this young man who grew up in the Ivory Coast produced a lot of chocolate out there. I hear. Stat was 70% of cocoa producers live under the poverty line. That was a stat. 7% of the final piece of chocolate sold goes actually to that farmer. So it's a really interesting supply chain, a really interesting just to kind of think about how these two chocolates, now they're empty, Keith, because I've got all these chocolates, too many to share, but really interesting to think about the story behind what kind of goes into that chocolate bar. So I hope we can unpack that today, but more importantly for the CEOs on the call here, we want to learn how to scale our impact as well. And I know you've done a lot of work with a turnaround at Alter Eco Foods coming in and trying to take it back to profitability. So with that being said, Keith, I'll open the floor to you with your presentation. You've got 30 minutes today. And then folks, just save some time for some Q&A afterward, because that's when the value of this also really gets good. So with that being said, Keith, I'll kick it off to you.
All right. Well, thanks, Kevin. I will share my screen and kind of walk you guys through a presentation, but I want this to be really interactive because the only value in this is if you guys really can take something away from this and actually bring it into your organization. But when we were talking about putting this together, we started out saying scale and impact, building sustainable success for consumer products or consumer businesses. And as I was putting this together, it's like, no, this is not just for consumer businesses. This is for every business. And I think everybody on the call knows how difficult it is to build an impact focused company. So hopefully what I talk about that I've done with Alter Eco and with some other companies for that matter kind of helps you be able to bring some of this back to your own organizations. So hopefully I can make this thing move. There we go. So what is impact? I mean, what is our focus here from an impact perspective? So you can Google this. You can find it out, in a lot of different places. There's social impact, there's economic, environmental, health and well-being, and I'm sure there's a lot of other categories that we could lump together, but these are the ones that I'm going to talk about and the ones that really kind of resonate with what we're doing at Alter Eco, with environmental obviously being one of our major focuses. So we talk about scaling and scaling versus growth. There's a big difference here. You can grow by putting more resources in, increasing your expenses, by in our case, by buying market share, if you will, by giving more promotions, lower prices, whatever to the marketplace to grow your business. That doesn't necessarily give you scale, doesn't necessarily give you sustainability for sure, and it doesn't give you scale of your impact if you're just focused on growth. Growth is important. I think all companies have to grow or you die eventually, and you grow through innovation. But to scale your impact while your company is growing is something that you have to focus on. You have to keep that impact focus right in the forefront of you, as opposed to just growth for throwing caution to the wind and growing for the sake of growth. So talk about the four different types of impact again, and I'll touch on what Alter Eco is doing with all of those, and you'll see how that leads into what we see as our vision and our mission for running this organization. So social impact addresses the social injustice. There's a lot of different impacts out there. For example, Habitat for Humanity is a perfect one because it's trying to address affordable housing or homelessness. Soup kitchens address social impact of food insecurities. Economic impact. A lot of you guys in on the call today and people that I met at Unite, economic impact is an important one for you, maybe the most important. And Miran and I have talked a lot about this as well, creating an ESOP where you're creating maybe not generational wealth, but you're creating wealth in a way that allows your organization to do more by being able to be more financially capable. And if they're aligned to the impact of the company, the impact mission of the company, they can help support that both financially and personally with their efforts. Environmental impact, that's where Alter Eco lives. It's not that we don't do all of these, and I think you have to do some of everything to be a well-rounded organization, but environmental impact is our first and foremost. We're trying to, and I tell people all the time, and I think I said this on stage, we try to improve the planet one chocolate bar at a time, and we'll talk a lot about what we're doing to do that as we go through today. But then health and well-being, that your customers, your consumers, your constituents, your supply chain, you got to take care of everybody, your employees and your employee families. I mean, that's something that's important. I mean, those of us that have families, if someone in your family is not well and not being taken care of, that impacts your ability to contribute to the organization, impacts your ability to help drive the impact of the organization forward. But we can't be everything to everybody. We need to focus on those things that we can change within our control, be clear on your targets, and then communicate, communicate, communicate. I love this saying, if you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. That's Wayne Dyer. He's a philosophy professor. And it's true. I mean, we focus oftentimes on the negative and how we're going to change the negative. But if we change the way we look at it and we look for opportunities, then it gives us the appetite and the ability to go and try to impact those changes. If I looked at regenerative farming as a negative as opposed to an opportunity, we'd never get to move forward on some of these things. We have to look at the opportunities that are there and try to understand how we can make some change within our scope of influence. So what's your impact? What's the single most important thing you and your company stand for? Like I said, you can't be everything to everybody, and you can have more than one impact, but you really, in my experience, is you really need to focus on what is that one thing that above all others, I'm going to do everything I can to try to drive toward that outcome. And then how do you know if you're having a positive impact? We'll talk about some transparency. So this is something that this is my view of the world. Your impact is your vision. And when you have your vision when your vision's clear, then strategy's kind of easy. Building out that strategy of how you're going to get to that vision and how you're going to be successful. So many consultants, and I've been one, I was a consultant. I started a consulting company, built a very successful consulting company and sold it. And I've had so many people tell me, consultants are really about helping you build your strategy. Consultants can't help you build your strategy. Consultants can help you articulate it in a way that you can communicate it, but you have to own it. A true consultant will come in and say, tell me your vision. Help me understand where you want to go. And then I'll work with you to build out the strategy. But like I said, the strategy is the easy part once you know where you want to go. Don't let a consultant own your strategy. Don't let a consultant own your vision. That's something you have to take ownership of. They can help you articulate it. They can put it in ways that can convince your stakeholders, and we'll talk a little bit about stakeholders in a minute, but you have to own this. Your impact becomes your vision. So what's the vision of Alter Eco? To become the regenerative snack brand for the future by changing the way the world does business. This is what we do. This is what we do and think about and live every day. Every decision we make comes back to, are we going toward our vision? And remember, I said, you can't be everything to everybody, and we're not. But in our principles, our core principles, restoring ecosystems is number one. But you can have a holistic approach toward those categories of impact. So improving livelihoods. All of our chocolates are Fair for Life certified. Now, everybody's heard about fair trade. Fair for Life's a step above that. We pay an average of 30% more than the market for our cacao beans. And in today's market, that's insane. That's an insane amount of money. Cacao beans have gone from $4,000 a ton in January of 2024 to over $13,000 a ton. Now they've come back down a little bit, but they're still about $11,000 a ton. So they've gone up, 3 times, settling in at 2.5 times. I can't pass those costs along to the consumers. But as Kevin pointed out in the opening, only 7% of that ever gets back to the farmers in the conventional farming. And yes, most cacao comes from Ghana and the Ivory Coast. There's roughly 3 major regions that produce cacao in the world: Western coast of Africa, Latin America, and a little bit out of Vietnam and Asian markets, just a little. 80% of the organic cacao comes out of Latin America, Ecuador being the largest, Peru, Dominican Republic, Colombia. These farmers, most of them do live below a poverty wage, especially compared to Western societies. So our goal is to educate these farmers, help them make that conversion of not only being rewarded and paid for the cacao products that they're doing, but in in moving beyond just raising cacao and going into, and we don't call it regenerative agriculture in our world. We call it dynamic agroforestry, because cacao plants don't grow like row crops do. That's regenerative agriculture. Regenerative agriculture is converting your row crop scenarios and monocrops to having ground cover and restoring the ecosystem through that process. Cacao plants grow in a jungle. And a lot of times, especially in Africa, they clear cut those jungles. They planted cacao plants, but they're a tree. So they don't grow like row crops. And you don't harvest them the same way you harvest row crops. You harvest them by hand. A cacao pod's about so big. And anywhere from 8 to 30 of them will grow on a tree, depending on how healthy that tree is. Another little interesting factoid about cacao pods is that they always have 40 beans. And so, depending on the size and the growth and the healthiness of the plant, the beans are bigger. So that's what you buy. You want the beans. The beans are where the cacao nibs are, which is what ultimately makes chocolate. Another one of our principles is reducing waste. And that leads to a social impact. We don't want to continue to create landfills. That's not good for anything, for anybody. I gave some of you, I had a few truffles at the event in San Diego, and some of you got some of the truffles. We're the only company in the world that wrapper on that truffle is actually backyard compostable. And I was talking to a guy in Boulder, Colorado yesterday, and he said Boulder has now banned products from going into compost that require industrial composting. They've focused on moving everything to backyard compostable. And I can tell you, I've put those truffle wrappers out in my garden, and in about 30 days, you can't find it. It's gone. We're the only company in the world that does that. And that's because we're committed to our vision of making the world a better place. But first and foremost, again, our impact is our vision. We're restoring ecosystems. We've converted over about 1,700 farmers now to dynamic agroforestry from monocropping. And that's a big thing. So you've got your vision. Now what do? Okay. You start on your strategic planning. Well, what are the steps it's going to take me to get to my vision? Am I going to focus on educating the farmers? Am I going to support financially them making that transition to dynamic agroforestry? Because for the first few years, they're going to make less money in that transition. Because what we're going to do is we're going to go in and help them plant other plants, other cash crops like plantains and passion fruit, avocados in some cases, pineapples, all those things grow in that ecosystem. But in doing that, they have to invest money in the plants. And it takes years for some of those plants to mature to where they're actually producing revenue. So the studies that we've done show that that conversion takes about 3 to 4 years. So how are we going to help those farmers get there? Well, that's part of our strategic planning because we're focused on our vision. We're saying, okay, we're allocating resources, meaning dollars in our case, to those farmers to help them with that conversion. And then, of course, you have to be adaptable. Nobody thought that cacao prices were going to jump up 2.5 or 3 times. If I'd have known that, instead of buying Alter Eco when I did, I would have invested in cacao futures because I could have had a bigger impact. A friend of mine sent me a meme around Christmas time that said cacao outperformed Bitcoin in 2024. I'm like, I don't need to see this. This is not helpful, but we'll work through it. We have to be adaptive to change. And that's where it comes in to we're starting to talk about. I wanted to bring this up. I mentioned this at Unite. So why is this so important to us? Now, yes, we're a food company. Yes, we consume products off the land. But this was put together by a group called the Global Footprint Network. And they measure the consumption of what we consume as a society, as a global population. They measure the impact it has on Earth. And in 2024, we consumed 1.75 Earths. To me, this makes what we're doing so vitally important. And if you look at that and take it beyond, beyond just the graph, that means by August 1st, we've used up everything the planet can regenerate this year. So we don't get any more food. Now, obviously, that's not really happening, but it's happening in a way that we are destroying the planet. And so agriculture is not the only problem here, but if we don't change the way we produce food, it's going to continue to get worse. And so we are so desperately focused on this. And it's not something that we can turn around in a year or 2 or 10. We're just continuing to push forward with this. So now we've talked a lot about impact. What's your impact? What's your vision? At the end of the day, and Kevin's heard me say this, if you don't make money, your impact has a finite life cycle. I was able to buy Alter Eco from the private equity group that owned it because it wasn't making money. And if I hadn't have bought it, they were going to shut it down. They had made the decision in 2023 that they were going to close the business. And I raised my hand and said, I'll buy it. So your impact is limited if you can't stay in business. You know, all those farmers that they had supported for over the years, they wouldn't have gotten any more support. All those compostable wrappers would have gone back to wrappers that are made out of plastic because other companies aren't willing to invest in the things that Alter Eco does. Why are we the only company that has a compostable truffle wrapper? Because it costs money. My truffle wrappers cost 3 times what I could buy if it were plastic. I won't do that. So understanding that profitability aspect is so key. And understanding your value contribution is critical to your success. I've got another slide here that talks about this, but education on the value that you're contributing, not just to the world and your impact, but the product that you're producing is so critically important. And the only way you're going to be able to convince people of that value is through educating them through social media, educating them through podcasts, educating them through all different ways to get your message out there. You have to be willing to charge for your value. You have to look for efficiency. So Alter Eco's been around for more than 20 years. It's never made money until last year. And I say ever, never. They brought across, they had institutional investors, they had friends and family, they did 3 or 4 different rounds of fundraising. And then in 2017, they sold the company, the founders, who are great people, and they set this impact. I didn't. They started with this impact mission for the company and this impact vision for the company when they founded the company. They just didn't know how to make it profitable. And it's understandable as a startup. It's not understandable as a 20-year-old company. So they sold out in 2017 to a private equity fund that is focused on impact companies. They've invested in a number of them. In 2022, they decided we can't continue to pour money into this. And in 2023, they went to the market. They didn't find a buyer. So they were going to take it off the market and close it down through a liquidation process. That's when I said, I'll buy it. Now, it wasn't that easy to go out and find money to support me to buy this. Even though I bought it at a bargain price, it was still more money than I had in my back pocket. And convincing investors to join me in this when the company had lost money for 20 years in a row was not easy to do. So I had to do these things first to convince them that I could turn this company around. The fact that I've turned around a few other companies helped because I had a pretty good track record. But I had to say, we're going to improve this operation. We're going to cut costs. We're not going to cut value. We're not going to cut impact. We're not going to cut quality, but we're going to cut cost. I'll give you a perfect example. I met with every single person in the company individually. We had 26 employees. I sat down with the QA manager, who is a great QA manager, one of the best I've ever worked with. She understands regulatory and FDA controls better than anybody I've worked with. And I said, Melissa, We use contract manufacturers for all of our production. Therefore, we rely on them for the most part to do our QA work. Your job seems to me to make sure that we're registering everything properly with our organic certifiers and the USDA and the FDA, and making sure our B Corp certification is kept up to date and those things. And she said, yeah. I said, so we only go through those audits once a year. And in the case of B Corp, once every 3 years. So she's like, so you're asking me what I do the rest of my time? And I said, yeah. She said, oh, I do a lot of research and this and that. And I said, so is your job a full-time job? She said, oh, you've never needed me full-time. And I said, okay. She said, oh, I brought that up with previous management, but they said, oh no, we need you around. I said, well, can you afford to go to part-time? And she said, I've always actually wanted to have my own consulting company. So if you'll be my first client, I'll be a consultant. Perfect. Win-win. I did that throughout the entire organization. Today, we have 7 employees. Last year, we grew 18%. The market grew 4. We went from losing multi-millions to making multi-millions. And our customers are way more satisfied because now we have money to invest in innovation and in marketing. And yes, we took a price increase just like the rest of the cacao industry or chocolate industry did, but we took less than most because I focused on improving our operations as opposing just passing cost to the customer. And by doing that, I got more market share and I got more velocity at the shelf. And I don't promote as often because in talking to my stakeholders, and customers are one of my really critical stakeholders, I've educated them on what my value is. Not only am I giving you the best tasting chocolate you can buy, and our Swiss manufacturers are some of the best in the world, if not the best. The Swiss have been making chocolate for over 450 years. They know what they're doing. And our partner is one of the best in Switzerland. So I'm giving you best tasting chocolate you can get. But I'm also doing more than that. I'm helping to implement dynamic agroforestry. I'm helping to improve livelihoods all throughout my supply chain. And I'm helping to reduce waste because of my packaging. So if I educate the customers to that, they're going to buy more of my product. And I've had a saying for a long time, volume can cover up a lot of sins. So the more volume you have, you spread that cost across more volume, it makes you more efficient, it makes you more profitable. So don't be afraid to tell your customer what you're really worth. And there's some customers that won't align to your impact and your vision. Sometimes all they want is a Reese cup, and that's okay. But make sure they understand what your impact and your vision is and what your transparency is in that. We produce what we call a regenerative report. We used to call it a sustainability report. Now we call it a regenerative report because that's what we're measuring. What is our impact on regeneration and dynamic agroforestry? And we're very transparent about it. We show how much of our cacao actually came from farms that are practicing dynamic agroforestry. And we've been so successful in that conversion that it keeps growing. Our goal is to get to 100% by 2030. In 2023, which is the last year we've gotten our data on, we're working on 2024 right now. 2023, we were at 82%. That's a big move from where we started. And you might ask how we measure that, because I think I've told some of you we have about 36,000 farmers that we buy from. We use satellite imagery. I can look at a satellite image of those areas and tell you whether they've got other trees other than cacao plants. We can see that they have plantain trees and timber trees and other things that are supporting that conversion to dynamic agroforestry. And so that's how we measure it. But we focus a lot on telling our customers how much value we're bringing to the market. And that's allowed us to be able to turn this company around. There's our transparency. That's our truffle in the shape of a globe and in the image of a globe, the earth. Because that's what we're trying to do, is show our receipts, show our consumers how we're impacting the globe, one chocolate bar or one truffle at a time. So that's the presentation. In conclusion, you know, understand what your impact is. Make sure you have clear alignment on your impact. Innovation includes being innovative in how you're running your organization and collaborating with your employees, with your stakeholders, with your customers, and then you can build sustainable success. So with that, I will stop sharing and be happy to take any questions.
Keith, thank you so much.